The Ideal of Human Unity, Chapter 26, The Need of Administrative Unity. In almost all current ideas of the first step towards international organization, it is taken for granted that the nations will continue to enjoy their separate existence and liberties, and will only leave to international action the prevention of war, the regulation of dangerous disputes, the power of settling great international questions which they cannot settle by ordinary means. It is impossible that the development should stop there. This first step would necessarily lead to others, which could travel only in one direction. Whatever authority were established, if it is to be a true authority in any degree, and not a mere concert for palaver, would find itself called upon to act more and more frequently, and to assume always increasing powers. To avoid preventable disturbance and friction, to avert hereafter the recurrence of troubles and disasters, which in the beginning the first limitations of its powers had debarred the new authority from averting, by a timely intervention before they came to a head, to bring about a coordination of activities for common ends, would be the principal motives impelling humanity to advance from a looser to a closer union, from a voluntary self-subordination in great and exceptional matters to an obligatory subordination in most matters. The desire of powerful nations to use it for their own purposes, the utility for weaker nations of appealing to it for the protection of their interests, the shock of actual or threatened internal disturbances and revolutions would all help to give the international authority greater power and provide occasions for extending its normal action. Science, thought, and religion, the three great forces which in modern times tend increasingly to override national distinctions and point the race towards unity of life and spirit, would become more impatient of national barriers, hostilities, and divisions, and lend their powerful influence to the change. The great struggle between capital and labor might become rapidly worldwide, arrive at such an international organization as would precipitate the inevitable step, or even present the actual crisis which would bring about the transformation. Our supposition, for the moment, is that a well-unified world state, with the nations for its provinces, would be the final outcome. At first, taking up the regulation of international disputes and of economic treaties and relations, the international authority would start as an arbiter and an occasional executive power, and change by degrees into a legislative body and a standing executive power. Its legislation would be absolutely necessary in international matters, if fresh convulsions are to be avoided. For it is idle to suppose that any international arrangement any ordering of the world arrived at after the close of a great war and upheaval could be permanent and definitive. Injustice, inequalities, abnormalities, causes of quarrel or dissatisfaction would remain in the relations of nation with nation, continent with continent, which would lead to fresh hostilities and explosions. As these are prevented in the nation-state by the legislative authority, which constantly modifies the existing system of things in conformity with new ideas, interests, forces, and necessities, so it would have to be in the developing world state. This legislative power, as it developed, extended, regularized its action, powers, and processes, would become more complex and would be bound to interfere at many points and override or substitute its own for the separate national action. That would imply the growth also of its executive power and the development of an international executive organization. At first, it might confine itself to the most important questions and affairs, which obviously demanded its control, but it would tend increasingly to stretch its hand to all or most matters that could be viewed as having an international effect and importance. Before long, it would invade and occupy even those fields in which the nations are now jealous of their own rights and power. And eventually, it would permeate the whole system of the national life and subject it to international control in the interests of the better coordination of the united life, culture, science, organization, education, efficiency of the human race. It would reduce the now free and separate nations first to the position of the states of the American Union or the German Empire, and eventually perhaps to that of geographical provinces or departments of the single nation of mankind. The present obstacle to any such extreme consummation is the still strong principle of nationalism, the sense of group separateness, the instinct of collective independence, its pride, its pleasure in itself, its various sources of egoistic self-satisfaction, its insistence on the subordination of the human idea to the national idea. But we are supposing that the newborn idea of internationalism will grow apace, subject to itself the past idea and temper of nationalism, become dominant and take possession of the human mind. As the larger nation group has subordinated to itself and tended to absorb all smaller clan, tribal, and regional groups, as the larger empire group now tends to subordinate and might, if allowed to develop, eventually absorb the smaller nation groups. We are supposing that the complete human group of united mankind will subordinate to itself in the same way and eventually absorb all smaller groups of separated humanity. It is only by a growth of the international idea, the idea of a single humanity, that nationalism can disappear. If the old natural device of an external unification by conquest or other compulsive force continues to be no longer possible, for the methods of war have become too disastrous, and no single empire has the means and the strength to overcome, whether rapidly or in the gradual Roman way, the rest of the world. Undoubtedly, nationalism is a more powerful obstacle to farther unification than was the separativeness of the old pettier and less firmly self-conscious groupings which preceded the developed nation-state. It is still the most powerful sentiment in the collective human mind, still gives an indestructible vitality to the nation, and is apt to reappear even where it seemed to have been abolished. But we cannot argue safely from the present balance of tendencies in the beginning of a great era of transitions. Already there are at work not only ideas, but forces, all the more powerful for being forces of the future, and not established powers of the present, which may succeed in subordinating nationalism to themselves far earlier than we can at present conceive. If the principle of the world state is carried to its logical conclusion and to its extreme consequences, the result will be a process analogous in principle, with whatever necessary differences in the manner or form or extent of execution, to that by which, in the building of the nation-state, the central government, first as a monarchy, then as a democratic assembly and executive, gathered up the whole administration of the national life. There will be a centralization of all control, military and police, administrative, judicial, legislative, economic, social, and cultural, in the one international authority. The spirit of the centralization will be a strong Unitarian idea, and the principle of uniformity, enforced for the greatest practical convenience, and the result a rationalized mechanism of human life and activities throughout the world, with justice, universal well-being, economy of effort, and scientific efficiency as its principal objects. Instead of the individual activities of nation groups, each working for itself, with the maximum of friction and waste and conflict, there will be an effort at coordination such as we now see in a well-organized modern state, of which the complete idea is a thoroughgoing state socialism, nowhere yet realized indeed, but rapidly coming into existence. Footnote: since this was written, this coming into existence has become much more rapid and thoroughgoing in three, at least, of the greatest nations, and a more hesitating and less clearly self-conscious imitation of it is in evidence in smaller countries. If we glance briefly at each department of the communal activity, we shall see that this development is inevitable. We have seen already that all military power, and in the world state that would mean an international armed police, must be concentrated in the hands of one common authority. Otherwise, the state cannot endure. A certain concentration of the final power of decision in economic matters would be also in time inevitable. And in the end, this supremacy could not stop short of a complete control. For the economic life of the world is becoming more and more one and indivisible. But the present state of international relations is an anomalous condition of opposite principles, partly in conflict, partly accommodated to each other as best they can be, but the best is bad and harmful to the common interest. On the one side, there is the underlying unity which makes each nation commercially dependent on all the rest. On the other, there is the spirit of national jealousy, egoism, and sense of separate existence, which makes each nation attempt at once to assert its industrial independence and, at the same time, reach out for a hold of its outgoing commercial activities upon foreign markets. The interaction of these two principles is regulated at present partly by the permitted working of natural forces, partly by tacit practice and understanding, partly by systems of tariff protection, bounties, state aid of one kind or another, on the one hand, and commercial treaties and agreements on the other. Inevitably, as the world state grew, this would be felt to be an anomaly, a wasteful and uneconomical process. An efficient international authority would be compelled more and more to intervene and modify the free arrangements of nation with nation. The commercial interests of humanity at large would be given the first place. The independent proclivities and commercial ambitions or jealousies of this or that nation would be compelled to subordinate themselves to the human good. The ideal of mutual exploitation would be replaced by the ideal of a fit and proper share in the united economic life of the race. Especially as socialism advanced and began to regulate the whole economic existence of separate countries, the same principle would gain ground in the international field, and in the end, the world state would be called upon to take up into its hands the right ordering of the industrial production and distribution of the world. Each country might be allowed for a time to produce its own absolute necessities, but in the end it would probably be felt that this was no more necessary than for Wales or Scotland to produce all its own necessities independently of the rest of the British Isles, or for one province of India to be an economic unit independent of the rest of the country. Each would produce and distribute only what it could to the best advantage, most naturally, most efficiently, and most economically, for the common need and demand of mankind, in which its own would be inseparably included. It would do this according to a system settled by the common will of mankind, through its state government, and under a method made uniform in its principles, however variable in local detail, so as to secure the simplest, smoothest, and most rational working of a necessarily complicated machinery. The administration of the general order of society is a less pressing matter of concern than it was to the nation-states in their period of formation, because those were times when the element of order had almost to be created, and violence, crime, and revolt were both more easy and more a natural and general propensity of mankind. At the present day, not only are societies tolerably well organized in this respect, and equipped with the absolutely necessary agreements between country and country, but by an elaborate system of national, regional, and municipal governments, linked up by an increasingly rapid power of communication. The state can regulate parts of the order of life with which the cruder governments of old were quite unable to deal with any full effect. In the world state, it may be thought, each country may be left to its own free action in matters of its internal order, and, indeed, of all its separate political, social, and cultural life. But even here, it is probable that the world state would demand a greater centralization and uniformity than we can now easily imagine. In the matter, for instance, of the continual struggle of society with the still ineradicable element of crime which it generates in its own bosom, the crudity of the present system is sure to be recognized, and a serious attempt made to deal with it in a very radical manner. The first necessity would be the close observation and supervision of the great mass of constantly recreated, corrupt human material, in which the bacillus of crime finds its natural breeding ground. This is, at present, done very crudely and imperfectly, and, for the most part, after the event of actual crime, by the separate police of each nation, with extradition treaties and informal mutual aid as a device against evasion by place shift. The world state would insist on an international as well as a local supervision, not only to deal with the phenomenon of what may be called international crime and disorder, which is likely to increase largely under future conditions, but for the more important object of the prevention of crime. For the second necessity it would feel would be the need to deal with crime at its roots and in its inception. It may attempt this first by a more enlightened method of education and moral and temperamental training, which would render the growth of criminal propensities more difficult. Secondly, by scientific or eugenic methods of observation, treatment, isolation, perhaps sterilization of corrupt human material. Thirdly, by a humane and enlightened jail system and penological method, which would have for its aim not the punishment, but the reform of the incipient and the formed criminal. It would insist on a certain uniformity of principle, so that there might not be countries that would persevere in backward and old world or inferior or erratic systems, and so defeat the general object. For this end, centralization of control would be necessary, or at least strongly advisable. So too with the judicial method. The present system is still considered as enlightened and civilized, and it is so comparatively with the medieval methods, but a time will surely come when it will be condemned as grotesque, inefficient, irrational, and in many of its principal features semi-barbaric, a half-conversion at most of the more confused and arbitrary methods of an earlier state of social thought and feeling and social life. With the development of a more rational system, the preservation of the old juridical and judicial principles and methods in any part of the world would be felt to be intolerable, and the world state would be led to standardize the new principles and the new methods by a common legislation and probably a general centralized control. In all these matters, it might be admitted, uniformity and centralization would be beneficial and to some extent inevitable. No jealousy of national separateness and independence could be allowed under such conditions to interfere with the common good of humanity. But at least in the choice of their political system and in other spheres of their social life, the nations might well be left to follow their own ideals and propensities, and to be healthily and naturally free. It may even be said that the nations would never tolerate any serious interference in these matters, and that the attempt to use the world state for such a purpose would be fatal to its existence. But, as a matter of fact, the principle of political non-interference is likely to be much less admitted in the future than it has been in the past or is at present. Always, in times of great and passionate struggle between conflicting political ideas, between oligarchy and democracy in ancient Greece, between the old regime and the ideas of the French Revolution in modern Europe, the principle of political non-interference has gone to the wall. But now we see another phenomenon, the opposite principle of interference slowly erecting itself into a conscious rule of international life. There is more and more possible an intervention like the American interference in Cuba. not on avowed grounds of national interest, but ostensibly on behalf of liberty, constitutionalism, and democracy, or of an opposite social and political principle, or on international grounds, therefore, and practically in the force of this idea that the internal arrangements of a country concern, under certain conditions of disorder or insufficiency, not only itself, but its neighbors and humanity at large. A similar principle was put forward by the Allies in regard to Greece during the war. It was applied to one of the most powerful nations of the world in the refusal of the Allies to treat with Germany, or practically to readmit it into the Comity of Nations, unless it set aside its existing political system and principles and adopted the forms of modern democracy, dismissing all remnant of absolutist rule. Footnote: the hardly disguised intervention of the fascist powers in Spain to combat and beat down the democratic government of the country is a striking example of a tendency likely to increase in the future. Since then, there has been the interference in an opposite sense with the Franco regime in the same country, and the pressure put upon it, however incomplete and wavering, to change its method and principle. The idea of the common interest of the race in the internal affairs of a nation is bound to increase as the life of humanity becomes more unified. The great political question of the future is likely to be the challenge of socialism, the full evolution of the omnipotent and omnipresent social state. And if socialism triumphs in the leading nations of the world, it will inevitably seek to impose its rule everywhere, not only by indirect pressure, but even by direct interference in what it would consider backward countries. An international authority, parliamentary or other, in which it commanded the majority or the chief influence, would be too ready a means to be neglected. Moreover, a world state would probably no more find it possible to tolerate the continuance of certain nations as capitalist societies, itself being socialistic in major part, than a capitalist or socialist. Great Britain would tolerate a socialist or capitalist, Scotland or Wales. On the other hand, if all nations become socialistic in form, it would be natural enough for the world state to coordinate all these separate socialisms into one great system of human life. But socialism, pursued to its full development, means the destruction of the distinction between political and social activities. It means the socialization of the common life and its subjection in all its parts to its own organized government and administration. Nothing small or great escapes its purview. Birth and marriage, labor and amusement and rest, education, culture, training of physique and character, the socialistic sense leaves nothing outside its scope and its busy, intolerant control. Therefore, granting an international socialism, neither the politics nor the social life of the separate peoples is likely to escape the centralized control of the world state. Footnote. This aspect of socialism in action has received a striking confirmation in the trend to total governmental control in Germany and Italy. The strife between national, fascist, socialism and pure Marxist socialism could not have been foreseen at the time of writing, but whichever form prevails, there is an identical principle. Such a world system is remote indeed from our present conceptions and established habits of life. But these conceptions and habits are already subjected at their roots to powerful forces of change. Uniformity is becoming more and more the law of the world. It is becoming more and more difficult, in spite of sentiment and in spite of conscious efforts of conservation and revival, for local individualities to survive. But the triumph of uniformity would naturally make for centralization. The radical incentive to separateness would disappear. And centralization, once accomplished, would in its turn make for a more complete uniformity. Such decentralization as might be indispensable in a uniform humanity would be needed for convenience of administration, not on the ground of true separative variations. Once the national sentiment has gone under before a dominant internationalism, large questions of culture and race would be the only grounds left for the preservation of a strong, though subordinate principle of separation in the world state. But difference of culture is quite as much threatened today as any other more outward principle of group variation. The differences between the European nations are simply minor variations of a common Occidental culture. And now that science, that great power for uniformity of thought and life and method, is becoming more and more the greater part, and threatens to become the whole of culture and life, the importance of these variations is likely to decrease. The only radical difference that still exists is between the mind of the Occident and the mind of the Orient. But here, too, Asia is undergoing the shock of Europeanism, and Europe is beginning to feel, however slightly, the reflux of Asiaticism. A common world culture is the most probable outcome. The valid objection to centralization will then be greatly diminished in force, if not removed altogether. Race sense is perhaps a stronger obstacle because it is more irrational, but this too may be removed by the closer intellectual, cultural, and physical intercourse, which is inevitable in the not-distant future. The dream of the cosmopolitan socialist thinker may therefore be realized after all. And given the powerful continuance of the present trend of world forces, it is, in a way, inevitable. Even what seems now most a chimera, a common language, may become a reality. For a state naturally tends to establish one language as the instrument of all its public affairs, its thought, its literature. The rest sink into a patois, dialects, provincial tongues, like Welsh in Great Britain, or Breton and Provençal in France. Exceptions like Switzerland are few, hardly more than 1 or 2 in number, and are preserved only by unusually favorable conditions. It is difficult indeed to suppose that languages with powerful literatures, spoken by millions of cultured men, will allow themselves to be put into a quite secondary position, much less snuffed out by any old or new speech of man. But it cannot be quite certainly said that scientific reason, taking possession of the mind of the race, and thrusting aside separative sentiment as a barbaric anachronism, may not accomplish one day even this psychological miracle. In any case, variety of language need be no insuperable obstacle to uniformity of culture, to uniformity of education, life, and organization, or to a regulating scientific machinery applied to all departments of life, and settled for the common good by the united will and intelligence of the human race. For that would be what a world state, such as we have imagined, would stand for, its meaning, its justification, its human object. It is likely, indeed, that this and nothing less would come in the end to be regarded as the full justification of its existence.